Hey everyone, and welcome to Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva, and today we are speaking with Kean Birch. Kean is an associate professor in the Department of Social Science at York University, I guess technically in Toronto, where he teaches in the undergraduate business and society program and the STS, sociology and geography graduate programs. It's a long title. Your business card must be like that long. Before moving to Canada in 2011, he worked at the Universities of Glasgow and Strathclyde in the UK. He is currently an associate editor on the leading international STS journal, Science as Culture, which is published by Taylor and Francis. Kean, thanks for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks for having me, Derek. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Terrific. Let's get right into it. What areas of research are you most interested at the moment?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm kind of obsessed with something slightly esoteric, so assets and assetization, so how things are turned into assets. And it's a bit of a kind of I don't know. It's sort of an interest in in what might be the boring side of the economy, the kind of accounting side of things. But actually, once you start digging into it, it becomes very interesting to look at, how something is changed. How a thing becomes an entity with value attached to it. So that's pretty much where what I'm doing. And the reason for looking at assets is because I think that they're increasingly central to contemporary capitalism, and in particular to a kind of dominant form of, I guess, the dominant form of value, I guess, creation and capture, which I call rentership, which is about trying to extract revenues and income from the ownership of these assets, rather than necessarily from the production of new kinds of goods and services and such like. And so rentership, as I said, is about the ownership of assets, and it's about, an asset is essentially a claim on future incomes and revenues. So it's about, rentership's about owning these future incomes and revenues, and these can come through, these incomes and revenues can come from all sorts of different things, from kind of differences in productivity, differences in, levels of scarcity, differences in level of quality, and these can be inherent to an asset, or they can be created and constructed through, how you transform the thing into an asset, basically.
I guess part of this would be that mantra of data is the new oil, right? If you have a ton of data, you can mine that data, you can analyze that data, you can then repackage it, and sell it onto an advertiser or to um, one of the folks I work with here at Orchid. She takes advantage of that address to line whenever you're filling out a form or signing up for something. She doesn't need it, so she puts in the company's name, and that way, if the data gets resold, she actually has a record of who the data originally belonged to. And realized recently that Quibi, that very short-lived streaming service, for short form content, has resold her data onto somebody, right? She got something in the mail, and address line two, pardon me, is Quibi. I guess that would be an example of that, in its maybe its poorest form because the company went out of business, but certainly data is the new oil. That sort of mantra, and potentially beyond that with lobbying governments to extend copyright and trademark laws again and again and again, and that sort of thing, to keep making use of incredibly old assets. Is that more or less in line with this rentership term?
Yeah, I think there's an aspect of that. I think with data, I think there's also another interesting side of it. It's not just not oil per se, because it's also something that is has other kinds of qualities to it. One being, it's a creation of our um, lives, and as part of the creation of our lives, there's an interesting reflexive element to it. By which I mean, we the more we know about what people do with our data, we change our behaviors, and this leads to a change in the quality of the data that is collected. But also, I think that there's a in a sense, unlike oil, data as well is there's a need for continual collection rather than a kind of just an extraction and sale. So there's a different quality to it there as well.
And it's
Um,
not very scarce.
no, it's not scarce, but it's also, in order to be valuable, you need to collect a lot of it, and so
Right.
there is an economy of scale to this as well, like oil, where you need to invest a lot of money to extract enough data to make it valuable, and that these are um, this creates problems for people who want to get into the data economy or what have you, whatever you want to call it, digital economy, data economy, techno-scientific economy. Um, so you have incumbents, the big tech firms that are there already, who are advantaged by their economy of scale that they already have, and their ability and capacity to collect, create a lot of data, and to extract value from their use of it, exploitation of it, and so on. Yeah,
Right. You just mentioned the big tech companies. I
yeah,
guess in the U.S. and Canada, and probably most of Europe, we would consider that the FANG, right? Facebook,
hmm
Apple to an extent. I think Amazon is more part of the A of the FANG term. Netflix certainly they collect their own mostly, but regardless, they have a ton of it. Google, like these large tech firms. Can you talk a little bit about more about how about the work you've done analyzing these large tech firms, the data they collect, and so on?
for sure. So I tend to take rather than FANG, I go for gafim as my as my acronym for big tech. So Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. So it's the biggest digital companies by market capitalization essentially in the world. So they're all the US-based companies. They are, I think they're almost all of them now are trillion-dollar companies. I think maybe Facebook isn't. And so they're these huge companies that have risen to uh, supremacy, dominance, or what have you over the last 10 years or so. And so that's what when I use big tech, that's what I'm talking about, those five companies. But I think you can include other companies when using the term, that might be slightly little big tech companies like Netflix and Uber, and other kinds of companies like that. It's just the big tech is just a size, a kind of size of magnitude, significantly larger than, say, those second tier kind of big tech companies. So yeah, I'm interested in how they go about collecting data, how they go about governing, managing that data, and how they go about valuing that data. What is it? Why is it that they're worth? These companies are worth on in terms of market capitalization. Why are they valued at $1 trillion? $1.5 trillion, close to $2 trillion, I think, for Apple. How do they get to that valuation, basically? Um, and so I've been doing some research on recently, some research on trying to understand this with colleagues. So I've been working with two colleagues, Troy Cochrane and Callum Ward, on recent research around big tech and this kind of assetization of data that they're engaged in. We've got a new. Can I what should we call it? Promote my research. Is that okay?
Absolutely. You got a book, you
Okay.
got a DVD, you got an album coming out. You plug what you want to plug.
Right. Okay. I'll do some plugging then. So we got a paper out in a journal called Big Data and Society. It just came. The article just came out recently, and in it we started from the premise. Okay, these valuations, trillion-dollar valuations, are based upon the idea that personal data is a highly valuable asset. Okay, so where does it, if we take that assumption, where do we see data come up on the balance sheets of these companies? And so we started looking at it, and actually we found an interesting and counterintuitive sort of finding, in the sense that we couldn't see where data sat on their balance sheets. The interestingly, the companies we looked at, but in particular companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, their balance sheets, they've got growing investment in tangible assets, so physical, hard, things, and a kind of less investment in the intangible assets that we might expect. So what we would think of as data being an intangible asset. And then there are other companies like Apple which stopped reporting on its intangible assets in 2018. So there's a strange, at least from our starting assumption, a strange kind of dissonance here, where these companies are not investing, or they're not recording their investment in in these kinds of intangible assets, and we can't really see where the personal data sits when they're recording things. So we then thought, okay, so if it's not on their balance sheets, maybe it's to do with how do the investors understand the value of the data of these companies. And so we looked at 10 years worth of earning calls between these 5 companies, between the investors and between the big tech executives. And personal data doesn't really come up. It's not mentioned. I think it's mentioned a couple of times in the space of 10 years across these 5 companies. But what we did notice was that the thing that comes up is users. So users are really important, and user engagement. And so this is what they're focused on when it comes to the understanding of their value. And so it's about what are the number of users, and what are those users doing, and that's what's important. So how do we measure what those users are doing? And so our argument was that the asset is this user. These are these users and their user engagement, and they're understood in particular ways. So it's, again, goes back to this assetization idea, where you have to be able to define what the asset is, and to do that you need certain kinds of metrics. And when it comes to something like, say, user engagement, some of those metrics are, how long has somebody looked at the screen on their browser for, right? And so there are standards for this now, where you can standardize the amount of, you've looked at this screen for 1 second, and you've seen half the screen. That counts as a unit of engagement, and so you can calculate these things, and so many likes on a page or a video, or so many comments, etc. And these are standardized as things that are deemed valuable, and so understood as the things that are valuable, because through the engagement you can then monetize your ecosystem by getting people to spend more time in it, and then you sell them advertising, or they spend more time in it and then they'll buy more things through your ecosystem. They'll spend more time of it and buy more sort of in-app purchases, so those are kind of the I guess some of the dominant ways that these big tech companies are trying to extract value through their ecosystems.
I'll make a small plug for Orchid. For anybody who's listening, we don't do any of that. We don't have any in-app analytics. We don't have cookies or JavaScript or anything on the website like these. And ultimately, it makes marketing Orchid much tougher. But I think it would be incredibly hypocritical to do those things and then say, we care about your privacy, we care about your online security. Oh, but we're collecting all this data through Mixpanel or Facebook Pixel or whatever, or Google Analytics. We literally don't do any of that. So to the extent that it makes it tougher, we still think it's worth it. And I hope that there are more and more companies who believe that there are other ways to measure engagement, whether it's simply transactions, or especially on a blockchain, where the transactions are public. It's very easy to see whether how many wallets are engaging with your smart contract, and how many transactions are happening, and even the inflows and outflows, because it's a public ledger. So you don't really need Google Analytics in that case for that, at least at an engagement level, maybe to figure out where things are dropping off. But you can also just go back to the classical user interviews. Hey, for anybody who's used the product and wants to give us feedback because we think there's a problem, let's have a one-on-one for 30 minutes. It's tougher, it's more expensive, but it's more of an opt-in approach, and it's still doable at the end of the day. So
Mhm. Just to follow up on that, I think
sure.
there might be like I can see a sort of trend in um, like some of the interest in digital technology, the kind of, at least in academia, there seems to be academia and sort of adjacent to academia, social commentary, these sorts of things. I think there's a trend towards curated content. So rather than it being about people relying on advertising and so on, there's a kind of interest in creating um, content that is curated by people who have an interest, same
Right.
interest as you, they have the same interest, and so on. So there's websites like the Syllabus. I don't know if you've come across that. That
Heard of
was
it.
the right. So it's so creation created with. I'm not sure. I think Evgeny Morozov was a key driver behind it, and there's a whole team that creates this kind of curated content for people. And it's a ton of, it looks like a ton of work because they're looking through thousands of bits and pieces of interesting articles, newspapers, podcasts, videos every month, and then they're producing a newsletter for people, and you can create your own personalized newsletter that you want information on X, Y, and Z, and so on. So I see that as a kind of a potential response to this kind of more kind of advertising led approach of big tech.
Yeah.
But I think there's probably a threat there as well to this kind of curated content, because Google is one of the complaints about Google is that it's simply extracting all that information from websites and putting it straight on the search results, and and therefore you're not going to the websites, and yeah.
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made that maybe it's not super tailored, but I pay for the Defiant, which is a newsletter about decentralized finance
All right.
protocols, and of course there's Bankless, which is all about all this move to away from banks and earning money in different ways, lending it out, and or buying non-fungible tokens and doing
Mm-hmm.
interesting novel things with that. And ultimately, people find it worth it for the most part, as far as I can tell, or else Bankless wouldn't have a team of, I think, 4 or 5 now. The Defiant has multiple team members as well, who, as far as I can tell, are working full time or at least part time there, getting paid to do that, and a variety of other Substack or Mailchimp based
Mm-hmm.
newsletters and other curated ways, or things like Patreon, right, where you're only producing
Yep.
content for the people who pay for it, or at least an
Yep.
ad-free version for the people who paid for it. Um, and there's people looking for ways to decentralize the underlying technology for things like Patreon as well, and remove even whatever, well, I guess quite a bit of data collection that a company like Patreon could do, um,
Mm-hmm.
um, and using other novel technologies to replicate that sort of ecosystem, which again takes out a lot of that data potentially, but it doesn't matter because you're finding a different way to make your platform sustainable, and to take yourself as an entity who's made the platform out of the equation as much as possible, and letting people actually coordinate directly instead, which is a bit of a
But,
tangent, but
well,
I am prone to
I don't
those.
think it is. I don't think it is a tangent. I think it's very relevant, because I think that I've been watching YouTube, particular kinds of YouTube clips for 10 years, and over that time I've seen a really significant shift, like you said, in the way that content producers are trying to make money for their content. And so what starts out on YouTube as you become a YouTube partner, and you can make money that way. And depending on how many followers you have and subscribers you have, you make and views you have, you make a certain amount of money. And obviously, people have heard of the superstars like PewDiePie, but there are lots of other people as well. Um, but that's really changed over those 10 years, where it's got to a point where YouTube's algorithms have changed, and um, it's led to a lot of content producers being unable to make money from their channels
Yeah.
anymore, and so they've shifted, yeah, to Patreon. And so there's a really interesting dimension to this, where big tech companies, so Google owns YouTube. Big tech companies are in many ways cannibalizing what is valuable about their platforms. So you, as soon as you start trying to extract more value from it, you try and up the take rate. I think that's an official industry term, take rate,
Yeah.
which is very interesting. Um, you damage the content producers and their ability to produce content that attracts users and user engagement to your platforms. And
Yeah.
so there's this really interesting,
Yeah.
self-damaging kind of
Yeah, absolutely
strategy.
self-damaging in the sense that it's what happened, I think, a few years ago, and YouTube has then had to try and correct. I'll use it in terms of, I think, for their own appearances, is this skew towards um, hyper-partisan extremism, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, so that the stuff that caused the most outrage was ultimately what was getting promoted, to the extent that very, very moderate people that I listen to on a regular basis started getting, promoted videos that they would never be interested, or perspectives that they would never be
Yep.
interested in, because as soon as you head down that rabbit hole of like, oh, I'm gonna watch this thing about, let's start roughly in the middle, maybe CNN. I'm not sure if that's considered the middle anymore in the U.S., but maybe I'll go back. Maybe I'll come back to here. CTV News,
Right.
fairly middle of the pack, maybe a little conservative leaning, and then all of a sudden you get suggested something from Sun News, and then of course that's defunct now. So then you get suggested something from Rebel Media, and you just end up going further and further down that rabbit hole. And when typically you're interested in CTV News, CBC News, global, fairly mainstream perspectives, but they were optimizing a while for whatever gets the most views, whatever gets the most engagement,
Yep.
likes and dislikes, and watching the full video as opposed to watching 30 seconds or a minute. And yeah, I think they've tried to come back the other way again. I don't know how successful they've been in that, but I've made my own YouTube experience very, very tailored, and I've turned off a lot of the personalization and things like
Mm.
that, which ultimately means I get ads for Mr. Clean instead of Dollar Shave Club. But I know that there's that trade off, and frankly, personally, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
Everything comes with a cost.
But I also think this speaks to another kind of issue with with the kind of analysis of digital, whatever you want to call it, digital capitalism, surveillance capitalism, technoscientific capitalism. That it's not as, first of all, it's not as I guess accurate might be the term, or not as good at guessing, working out our preferences as some people suggest it is. And so there's a real problem with this kind of association jumping, I guess, between your interest in whatever CTVU news, and then suddenly that moves to whatever Rebel Media or whatever. That seems a really bad set of targeted advertising to my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that seems to speak to that kind of, there's a kind of issue there. I also think there's an issue of this issue of content moderation, which I think um, has come up with things like the Facebook Oversight Board, I think,
Yeah.
and that's had a lot of a lot of people criticize that for being just a bit of I don't know what you call it, some form of corporate
Theater.
responsibility washing, yeah, theater, whatever, yeah, because I think that I think one of the key issues that is not dealt with is it's you can moderate your forums, your platforms, and take stuff down, but you've still made money from it, but prior to it being
Sure.
taken down. So
Yeah.
I think there's in order to address those issues, I think you have to cut that link between the monetary income that you get and this kind of content. So you have to give back your money, the money or something. The big tech has to give back the money they made from it, or put it somewhere for to combat these kinds of socially regressive um, stories and
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Give York U their $5,000 back that they spent on those Facebook ads.
Is that an actual thing?
No, no,
Okay.
I just you work there, yeah, like you teach there,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we're
yeah,
talking about
yeah.
these platforms. So I just pulled an obvious example as opposed to
But
trying to go outside of this conversation and pull some brand. Like Procter and Gamble, I think last year suspended all
mm,
advertising temporarily on Facebook. A bunch of other brands as well. When or earlier this year, I think.
yeah,
I don't remember. It was sometime late last year, early this year, because of the Capitol riots in the U.S.
yeah, yeah,
And the fact that a lot of this content was allowed to exist on Facebook, they were allowed to coordinate on Facebook, etc. Regardless of how you feel about it, I'm not laying judgment on people using Facebook as a platform to coordinate. But in their own rights, the advertisers, a bunch of advertisers, pulled hundreds of of dollars in ongoing revenue for Facebook as, I guess, retaliation. You'd put it, and ultimately, for me, that's the law of 2 feet in action, but with your wallet, right? Like that's our marketing spend. We don't like the way you're allowing people to use your platform, so we're going to stop spending money on the platform. That's well within their rights to do so, and certainly, I guess, a consequence of people just not liking the way you're running things, as opposed
but
to any
yeah,
any me applying any sort of specific value judgment on that.
but I don't think it led to a decrease in Facebook's
No,
advertising revenue. I think that's what's really
that's
interesting
the
about it.
problem. Yeah,
But it, which is again, there's a two sides to this where it didn't decrease the advertising revenue because I think a lot of other, you can just simply sell it to other companies,
yeah.
smaller companies, and make the
Ads
same amount
got
of money.
cheaper temporarily.
Right. And you had there was a great story by somebody called Shoshana Wadinsky, who's a tech journalist. I can't remember who she works for, but she did a story about the advert for those uh, pajamas. So there was these that just proliferated across the web during that period of time because I guess they're buying out all the cheap advertising space. So you just saw them everywhere, and they'd follow you around the web. Um,
Nice.
but also, but there's a second side to this, which is um, the fact that companies like I think it was Procter and Gamble, like they did cut their advertising spend, and it just didn't impact their sales. And so
Yeah, that too.
there's two dimensions to this, where what it's supposed to be doing, advertising leading to sales and leading to yeah, increasing sales, doesn't happen. But on the other hand, advertising for far right groups and these kinds of things seems to be generating more hate and yeah kind of
Yeah,
problematic social responses. Yeah.
which you and I saw very close to home. I saw very, very close to home just a couple weeks ago. Um, we need,
Mm,
we're
yes.
actually starting to run out of time here. We need to come back to
Right.
this term, techno-scientific capitalism. I was
Right.
reading your paper in, I guess it's in Sage, Techno-Science Rent Towards a Theory
Mhm.
of Rentership for Techno-Scientific Capitalism. I don't read a lot of academic papers. I do hear other people tell me about them in the news. But
Right.
this was the first time I had heard this term. So I don't know if you and a colleague coined it. But I thought it was a really interesting term. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit what that term means to you and where your interest in this topic originally came from.
So technoscientific capitalism or technoscience rent or both?
Techno-scientific capitalism. I think we touched on
Capitalism, yeah.
rentiership. That
Okay.
that one's
Yeah,
probably
okay.
pretty clear. So yeah, the
Done
capitalism
that.
term.
Yep. Yeah, so I think it's so a lot of people talk about different types of capitalism. So I've mentioned a couple of notions already, like digital capitalism, data capitalism, surveillance capitalism. And so this is a kind of broader term. rather than being focused specifically on the digital or or data. So I think that there's a need to be a bit broader about thinking about contemporary capitalism, and so that's my starting point. It comes, I think, from a I've it's kind of a little bit. I'm not sure depressing is the wrong word, but like it's always surprising to look back at my career and think, oh, I'm nearly 20 years since I started my PhD, and that's kind of where I see the start of my academic career. So I feel like you know, I've been here doing this for quite a while now, but I could look back in hindsight at where I kind of some of these ideas came from, but I keep on kind of coming back to somebody called Jean-Francois Lyotard, who is a French, I guess you'd call him a postmodernist or post-structuralist. He wrote a very famous book that was originally published as I think a report for the Quebec government called The Postmodern Condition, and it's been pretty influential since then. And his point in it was that we're moving away from these kind of grand, what he calls meta narratives of society's development and future and direction and so on, and we're moving towards a series of contested smaller narratives, and a lot of this is based on the kind of rejection of the notion of truth, there being a truth in the world that we can work towards, and instead it's being replaced by what he saw as the drive towards the performance or efficiency of the kind of capitalist system. And so the more money you have, the more you can increase and reinforce the performance of your system, and so you end up with this kind of tying together of the way I see it, the tying together of technoscience, so technology and science, with capitalism, and at the same time, you get technoscience generating a different form of capitalism. So that's why it's a two-way process. So we can think of things like, to kind of give you an example, notions that come out, like more kind of recent kind of ideas around, the economy, how the economy works, and so on, are dependent upon this, or framed by this idea of sort of technological disruption. And so that's one way of thinking about the economy, is that people are working towards disrupting it, right? Because that's the way they understand, technologically disrupting it, because that's the way they understand how capitalism works. And so that's one way that capitalism has been changed by technoscience. And then on the other side, technoscience is increasingly framed by the search for returns, monetary returns. And so you develop new technologies because they're going to make money. And so that's the other side, flip side of it, where technoscience is driven by capitalism. So there's this two-way process I see going on that leads to problematic outcomes. We touched on that kind of technoscience rent. So that would be one example of a problematic outcome, where people are literally innovating to extract rents. So they're innovating to instead of creating new products, new services, even new markets, necessarily they're trying to create ways of owning things that already exist, capturing or disrupting existing kind of markets. We could think of Uber. Uber is it's not a new product or new service. It's just a way of trying to arbitrage. It's a form of regulatory arbitrage to destroy taxis, right? And so that's it doesn't actually produce social benefits in a sense. You could have far better social benefits by putting all that money that's been invested into Uber into public transit, and to creating better public transit and better urban planning, and all these sorts of things that would make have much more of a societally collective benefit than Uber does. But yet Uber is has all this investment. There's a ton of people who put a lot of money into it. I don't know what it's currently worth, but it's it's in the billions, probably getting close to 100 billion in terms of market capitalization. It hasn't made any money.
Yeah, that's the really.
And essentially,
how long has it been going?
And
still, I think they're still hoping for profitability next year.
Yeah, yeah. and they've just junked their autonomous driving division. I
Yeah.
think they've just jettisoned that as a kind of like, when that's not going to work, we're not going to make money out of that. Let's get rid of it. Um, and so it's yeah. So that's what I see as being technoscientific capitalism. This kind of entanglement of technoscience and capitalism in both directions. Yeah.
So looks like fiscal year 2020, total revenue. This is probably in billions. Yes, it is. 11,139,000,000. The cost of that was 5.1 billion. So gross profit was 5.9, almost 6 billion. But then you have 10.8 billion in operating expenses for a operating income of negative 4.86 billion dollars. Net income
Right.
to common stockholders negative $6.768 billion. So yeah, they are and a negative earning per share of $3.86. So yes, they are
Yeah.
still not profitable as of fiscal year 2020. I know that they anticipate being profitable in 2022, largely because of not delivery. Um, yeah, actually, yes, because of delivery services, because they deliver for just about everybody now. McDonald's, Starbucks, like I can
Hmm.
get just about
Hmm.
anything delivered in my small little town west of London, Ontario. Whereas this
Yeah.
time last year, that was not happening. I've used it a couple times, so I'm certainly slightly guilty of this. But before, I was literally just not buying anything from those restaurants because it was just
Yeah.
too much hassle to drive 20 minutes there and 20 minutes back. Because basically, by the time I ordered the food, I had to get in the car and go.
Yeah.
So we don't do it often. I think we've done it maybe 3 times or 4 times in the last year. But it has opened up possibilities, and from what I've heard about their earnings calls, um Uber is really banking on delivery at this point for to make them profitable. um Lyft, I don't think, is engaging in delivery. They're anticipating profitability in next year as well, whether that's just more rides or charging higher rates, much closer to what taxis typically charge, which kind of undoes
Yeah.
the whole raison d'être for Uber and Lyft to exist in the first place if they're charging more or less what taxis did before, according to people who have often taken taxis, or cabs, whatever term you prefer. But yeah, that's they're gonna do what they're gonna do, and until there's some sort of regulation that I guess changes their business model, um, which has happened at a local level every once in a while, and then in England specifically, I think, or at least London. Over the past couple of years, they've been battling with Uber there, for Uber to really up their game, and be more like the black cabs, and the level of knowledge that those drivers have of the city of London. They're gonna just keep doing what they're doing.
Yeah. So I think it's yeah, it's morphing. Well, it's always been a kind of not just a regulatory play, but also a labor exploitation play.
Yeah,
And so it's got worse over time, where the amount of money that drivers get declines, and the system they have in place is designed to uh, kind of force force you to work, as many hours as possible in order to maintain your, I guess, your privileged status as a certain kind of driver that gets more fares and so on and so forth.
yeah,
So the whole thing is just, I don't know. It's I find it bizarre, and I think people have been banging on about how bad a business model it is for ages. Not and this includes people in like the Financial Times. There's some great work that comes out of a a group there called Alphaville, and they've
yeah,
talked
yeah.
about their business model. So it's none of this is surprising. I think it's part of a a kind of a series of expectations that investors have around, we expect this to become a monopoly, and
Sure.
so it becomes what I think of as a kind of expected monopoly rent, where you're trying to you're you're as an investor, you're expecting something to turn into a monopoly, and therefore you're willing to just keep on
Pouring money into it.
investing in it. Yeah,
Yeah.
pouring more money. Yeah, and eventually, because it becomes self-reinforcing, because it's cheaper for that company to borrow money than other companies, it becomes self-reinforcing because they can buy out their competitors, they can outcompete their competitors, and then they do become a monopoly.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened with Amazon. Amazon's a really interesting case, example of that kind of thing. Um, if you are a company in another sector, Amazon decides to suddenly move into your business sector, your value goes down.
Hmm.
Um, because investors know that it's cheaper for Amazon to borrow than it is for you, and you won't be able to compete.
Cool. So, I guess on that topic of monopolies, what are your thoughts on the recent bills, or the recent bill introduced to strengthen laws, um, I guess specifically in the U.S., for tech, to hold tech monopolies accountable, including the American Innovation and Choice Online Act?
Sure. So I think there's a set of bills. I think it's 5 bills that came out either like last week or this week.
Hmm.
And these are all proposals at this stage, so they have to obviously get voted on and legislated. But they're five bills that have been proposed as a result of a really significant investigation by the U.S. Congress into big tech and digital markets and the kind of monopoly problems that have arisen there. And this congressional hearing lasted, I don't know, it was nearly 2 years or a year and a half, and it finished last year.
Yeah.
They produced a huge report in October last year, 450 pages, which is a really fascinating report. I got stuck at page, I don't know, 380 because I was plowing my way through it, and yeah, it was like, this is really interesting, but it's really quite dry in places.
Yeah,
So
that's the problem with
yeah,
those. They gotta
yeah,
they gotta give it some pizzazz.
right.
Give me a
But it's
five
got
minute
yeah,
video.
right. But it's got some really interesting like snippets and stories in there, and I watched some of the hearings as well, the actual video hearings,
Yeah.
and they're really interesting, especially the testimony of competitors. And often this is very small competitors, so it's the one I remember is pop sockets, so those things you get on the back of your phone that you can hold, and they were talking about how they got impacted by Amazon's decision making,
Oh wow.
and how it affected their revenues and such like.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these 5 bills come from as a direct consequence of that investigation and that report. And there's also, as I said, it's really fascinating. There's all sorts of insights into the big tech companies. Uh, the so just to give you a quick kind of précis, I guess, or summary of some of the issues that they've been alleging. So Apple, for example, it's the alleging that they're exploiting their App Store rules to basically create their own apps after they see other app developers doing well. Google using their basically paying for their browsers and such like to be set as defaults in Apple phones and things like that. Facebook buying up competitors specifically to stop competition, but also restricting access to their what's called their social graph. So when a competitor company is using using their social graph to run a business, if they do too well, they restrict access. That's another allegation. And then Amazon is all about self-preferencing, so allegations of self-preferencing and pressure on third parties to use their services. So there's something called fulfillment by Amazon, where Amazon delivers, and so there's allegations that there are pressures to sign up to that, and that costs money, obviously, and so on. So these 5 bills are all designed in some way or another to kind of address these issues. And I actually, I could run through them if you really want, or I can highlight
Uh
the kind of general
if I've got a few
general
more
issues
minutes,
that.
if you want to go
Okay.
through them real quick, sure.
So I think there's the American Innovation Choice Online Act. That's they're trying to prohibit discrimination on platforms. So self-preferencing basically. So the platform owner self-preferencing its own products and services.
Right.
There's the Platform Competition Opportunity Act, which is about trying to limit acquisitions of competitors, basically. Um, the Ending Platform Monopolies Act. And so this is about trying to, again, about self-preferencing that disadvantages competitors. And so it's about trying to stop them, stop companies what they say, leveraging the control over their kind of platform. Then there's the Augmenting Compatibility and Competition by Enabling Services Switching Act, which is basically data. Yeah, it's
Very,
basically about
very
data.
on the nose
Yeah,
name.
right. It's yeah, data interoperability. So making it easier to move your data from Facebook to somewhere else or whatever.
Yeah, but
And then there's a
one
merger.
quick second.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
have been, I guess, to that extent, there have been voluntary initiatives taken at Google and Facebook specifically, and probably other platforms to make that easier. Google Takeout is their iteration on that, or their initiative on that. I think Facebook has something similar where you can get a full export of your data. I think the real problem there is that there's no standards. It is obviously completely voluntary. Google has, I think Google's initiative was originally started by, I'm probably going to get the wrong name, but Matt Mullenweg, who's a big open source advocate. Um, and when he went to go work for Google, was like I think this was like his 10% um, project. Like you're allowed to use 10% of your
Mhm.
time to build something else that maybe or maybe does not benefit Google. This was what he started working on. And so eventually it's been adopted as like an official thing. But because it's a 10% project, or because Google obviously doesn't really have a real impetus legally or otherwise to do it, it took years to actually cover most Google products. I don't think it
Mhm.
still covers all Google products. And of course, you get this morass of data. You're like, well, okay, well, how do I move this somewhere else?
Yep.
Well, there's very few import mechanisms available, and then let's assume it's a CSV. You might have to completely rearrange the entire thing in order to bring it somewhere else, or remove a bunch of stuff that the new platform doesn't want. So
Yep.
I'm always a little hesitant, because obviously the devil's in the details when you regulate this sort of thing. But if it's done right, whatever that means to whomever hears the term, yeah, that would be amazing. It would be great to be able to say, I'm done with Facebook. I'm moving.
Mhm.
I want to move all my stuff to, not a good example, but Twitter, or Path back in the day, because Path was a lot of fun, or Pounce, or all these other effectively dead social networking platforms that tried to piggyback off of Facebook. Even Twitter, I
Mhm.
remember, had an integration with Facebook way back in the day, where anything you tweeted would also go to Facebook. Well, once Twitter got a couple million users, cut them off, right? You're not allowed to
Yep.
do that anymore.
Yep.
Exactly what you were talking about earlier, where Facebook can, whenever they feel like it, cut somebody off from their social graph. That's been happening
Yep.
for over a decade. So this is unfortunately, unfortunately, not a new problem. It would be nice to
Nope.
get some, I would say, light touch, but enough regulation in order to just make it easier, and apply some sort of standard, even if it's a consortium of companies coming together and saying, okay, this is the standard we're going to use. If everybody uses this, we can all interoperate. Fine. Like, government doesn't need to solve everything, but it'd be nice if they pushed everything in the right direction in this case. In my opinion.
Yeah, I think interoperability is one of these big things that we don't really hear as much about as we should. There's some good. The sci-fi author Cory Doctorow
Yes.
has written some really interesting stuff about interoperability in what he calls, or what people call, agonistic interoperability. So the ability to to do it without the consent of Facebook. And
Yeah.
so that's part of the problem, is the fact that Facebook sets the rules of your access to it and can cut off, as you said, cut off your access to it, and that's the problem. And then you can get a dump of useless data,
Yeah.
yeah, in an Excel file or whatever. And what do you do with it? One thing I was going to do was to actually think about, well, maybe I said to do. I'm thinking about shifting to Proton Mail from Gmail. Um, And
Yeah.
so I'm going to see what the experience is, because they have the ability to port things across. And so if it's a relatively easy thing to do, then I can, it's uh, that's one way of, that's hopefully going to be not too time consuming, or too much effort and so on. But I'm just dreading the kind of need to spend a couple of days dealing with everything. And
Hopefully it doesn't
yeah,
take that
that sort
long.
of
I
thing.
mean, ultimately,
No, no.
the IMAP standard exists, thankfully, thanks to a
No.
bunch of RFCs back in the day, and Google does conform to those, and so does pretty much everybody else. So I suspect Proton, you'd probably need to, well, I guess it could be OAuth
No.
authentication in order to bring things over, what basically means like you're on Proton's interface, sign in with Google, here's the permissions you're going to grant Proton. Obviously, you're going to want to say yes because you're trying to bring everything over.
Mm-hmm.
And then in one fell swoop, probably within an
Swoosh.
hour or
Yeah.
two, the 5, 10, 15 gigabytes of email you've got there in Google, because it's data center to data center, probably nice big fat pipe, you're done. And then it's incumbent on you to change your settings, um,
Yeah.
assuming you have like at birch.uk or something like that for your email, or me, I've got dereksilva.ca, and that's where I use my email. Then I have to update my DNS settings, obviously. But if you're switching to like a protonmail.com or p.me email address, then really it's incumbent on you to just tell everybody, I'm stop using Gmail, and you could also set up a
Yeah.
Gmail account to forward everything over.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So that's one of my I guess one of my on my to-do
yeah,
list is to do that. And
was there
at some
was there
point.
one more bill that we didn't cover yet?
Oh yeah, just it's a rather boring bill, merging filing fee modernization act,
Make
which
it
is not really
really
particularly
expensive.
exciting.
No,
Yes,
I
yeah, but that's part of it, is to make it more
I was gonna
expensive, I
say,
think.
actually,
Yeah.
maybe it should be like, maybe it should be based on amount of data or number of users, or some sort of impact measure, where, oh, now I know my my do not disturb is turned off. Maybe it should be some sort of measure of impact, and maybe that's already embedded in the bill. I don't make it a habit of reading American
Yeah.
proposals and bills. But yeah, I guess if that would be the intent, maybe that is exactly what should happen.
Yeah. Well, that's what the Europeans interestingly do. So the Europeans are a little bit ahead of North Americans, I think, on most of these things, and there's some. So um, I think it's the, oh, I can't remember what it is. Margaret Vestager is the commissioner for the area. So it's competition or it's digital economy. I can't remember which one it is.
Yes, I have.
Uh,
I
yeah,
do know who you're referring to.
yeah. So they've released a statement about a merger, which basically stated quite clearly that they take data assets into account when considering mergers. And so that's a really interesting, for me, being obsessed with data and assets. That's a really interesting statement for them to make, because then it's clear that they're considering these things,
Hmm.
and they're worried about the entrenchment of data monopolies and the impact that these have, and they're trying to consider them in their merger rules. And what the difference the Europeans with the European system is that this is likely to become part of their, what they call their framework conditions,
Yeah.
and so that's the, the rules of the game that people have to abide by if they want to, operate within the European economy. And so that's a kind of interesting change, I think.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long that's been around, but yeah.
Cool. Keen, we've gone over time,
Okay.
but thank you so much for your time today. This was a really interesting conversation. I would actually highly recommend people look you up and actually read some of these academic papers, assuming you have access to them. The one about technoscience. I'll say the name again. Technoscience Rent, toward a theory of rentership for technoscientific capitalism. It's actually, I've only got a few paragraphs in, but it's quite good.
No,
So for
thanks.
anybody who's interested in what companies are doing with your data and all the different ways they can and probably are monetizing it, and maybe even and of course some of the side effects and that sort of thing. You even touch on the right to repair type stuff here with tractors. John Deere, I think, is particularly guilty of this, of forcing farmers to come back to the dealership in order to get things serviced, because they don't want you mucking around anymore with the electronics, the software, etc., despite the fact that many of these farmers actually know exactly what they're doing and know exactly what code to tweak or what thing to replace in order to get up and running again, and often live really far away from the dealership because they're in rural Montana or in northern Ontario or in the middle of Saskatchewan. They don't have days to go, take this trailer, the tractor that runs maybe 40 kilometers an hour, 70 at best, on the highway, and leave it out of commission when they know what to do. And this is something that I know Cory Doctorow has written also quite a bit about, and many others, about this right to repair. And I think things are heading generally in the right direction there, but there's definitely been a lot of pushback. I would actually encourage everybody to look up this particular paper and others that Kean has written, because they're actually, I think, quite good.
Thank you very much. And just to plug, there is a website called rentership.com.
Perfect.
Where all the papers should be. This is kind of current research project that I'm doing.
Okay.
And they're all open access, and so anyone can download them. You don't need to be someone at a university
Or subscriber.
So we try and make them all open access, and there's a bunch of other shorter pieces in the media and such like. So I just had a piece out yesterday in the Toronto Star about how we can tame big tech, a suggestion for how we can tame big tech. So all of that material is there on rentership.com.
Terrific. Thanks so much for sharing that. And thanks everybody for listening to Private Podcast today. We will see you next time.
Thank you very much for having me.